The Sinking of the Titanic and Other Great Sea Disasters, edited by Logan Marshall. Captain Rostron's Report. Less than 24 hours after the Cunard Line steamship Carpathia came in as a rescue ship with survivors of the Titanic disaster, she sailed again for the Mediterranean cruise which she had originally started upon last week. Just before the liner sailed, H.S. Bride, the second Marconi wireless operator of the Titanic, who had both of his legs crushed on a lifeboat, was carried off on the shoulders of the steamship's officers to St. Vincent's Hospital. Captain A.H. Rostron of the Carpathia addressed an official report giving his account of the Carpathia's rescue work to the general manager of the Cunard Line, Liverpool. The report read, I beg to report that at 12:35 a.m. Monday, I was informed of urgent message from Titanic with her position. I immediately ordered ship turned around and put her in course for that position, we being then 58 miles south, 52 east from her. All heads of all departments called and issued what I considered the necessary orders to be in preparation for any emergency. At 2:40 a.m., saw flare half a point on port bow. Taking this for granted to be ship shortly after we sighted our first iceberg. I had previously had lookouts doubled, knowing that the Titanic had struck ice, and so took every care and precaution. We soon found ourselves in a field of bergs, and had to alter course several times to clear the bergs. Weather fine and clear, light air on sea, beautifully clear night, though dark. We stopped at 4 a.m., thus doing distance in 3 hours and a half, picking up the first boat at 4:10 a.m. Boat in charge of officer, and he had reported that Titanic had foundered. At 8:30 a.m. last boat picked up. All survivors aboard and all boats accounted for. 15 lifeboats, 1 boat abandoned, 2 Berthon boats alongside. Saw 1 floating upwards among wreckage, and according to second officer, senior officer saved, 1 Berthon boat had not been launched, it having got jammed, making 16 lifeboats and 4 Berthon boats accounted for. By the time we had cleared first boat, it was breaking day, and I could see all within area of 4 miles. We also saw that we were surrounded by icebergs, large and small, huge field of drift ice with large and small bergs in it, the ice field trending from northwest round west to southeast, as far as we could see either way. At 8 a.m., the Leyland SS California came up. I gave him the principal news and asked him to search, and I would proceed to New York. At 8:50 proceeded full speed while researching over vicinity of disaster, and while we were getting people aboard, I gave orders to get spare hands along and swing in all our boats, disconnect the fall, and hoist up as many Titanic boats as possible in our davits. Also get some on forecastle heads by derricks. We got 13 lifeboats, 6 on forward deck and 7 in davits. After getting all survivors aboard and while searching, I got a clergyman to offer a short prayer of thankfulness for those saved, and also a short burial service for their loss in saloon. Before deciding definitely where to make for, I conferred with Mr. Ismay, and as he told me to do what I thought best, I informed him I considered New York best. I knew we should require clean blankets, provisions, and clean linen, even if we went to the Azores, as most of the passengers saved were women and children, and they hysterical, not knowing what medical attention they might require. I thought it best to go to New York. I also thought it would be better for Mr. Ismay to go to New York or England as soon as possible. And knowing I should be out of wireless communication very soon if I proceeded to Azores, it left Halifax, Boston, and New York, so I chose the latter. Again, the passengers were all hysterical about ice, and I pointed out to Mr. Ismay the possibilities of seeing ice if I went to Halifax. Then I knew it would be best to keep in touch with land stations as best I could. We have experienced great difficulty in transmitting news, also names of survivors. Our wireless is very poor, and again we have had so many interruptions from other ships, and also messages from shore, principally press, which we ignored. I gave instructions to send first all official messages, then names of passengers, then survivors' private messages. We had haze early Tuesday morning for several hours. Again, more or less all Wednesday from 5:30 a.m. to 5 p.m. Strong south-southwesterly winds and clear weather Thursday with moderate rough sea. I am pleased to say that all survivors have been very plucky. The majority of women, first, second, and third class, lost their husbands and, considering all, have been wonderfully well. Tuesday, our doctor reported all survivors physically well. Our first-class passengers have behaved splendidly, given up their cabins voluntarily, and supplied the ladies with clothes, etc. We all turned out of our cabins and gave them to survivors. Saloon, smoking room, library, etc. Chapter 12, Part 2. The following list of the survivors and dead contains the latest revisions and corrections of the White Star Line officials and was furnished by them exclusively for this book. List of survivors. First cabin. Anderson, Harry. Antoinette, Miss. Appiranelt, Miss. Appleton, Mrs. E.D. Abbott, Mrs. Rose. Allison, Master and Nurse. Andrews, Miss Cornelia I. Allen, Miss E.W. Astor, Mrs. John Jacob and maid. Albert, Monsieurs N and maid. Barrett, Carl B. Bisette, Miss. Barkworth, A.H. Bucknell, Mrs. W. Bowerman, Miss E. Brown, Mrs. J.J. Burns, Miss C.M. Bishop, Mr. and Mrs. D.H. Blank, H. Bessina, Miss A. Baxter, Mrs. James. Brayton, George. Bonnell, Miss Lily. Brown, Mrs. J.M. Bowen, Miss G.C. Beckwith, Mr. and Mrs. R.L. Bisley, Mr. and Mrs. Bonnell, Miss C. Cassibier, Mrs. H.A. Cardeza, Mrs. J.W. Candell, Mrs. Churchill. Case, Howard B. Camerion, Kennard. Casaboro, Miss D.D. Clark, Mrs. W.M. Chabinas, Mrs. B.C. Charlton, W.M. Crosby, Mrs. E.G. Carter, Mrs. Lucille. Calderhead, E.P. Chandanson, Miss Victoria. Cavendish, Mrs. Terrell and maid. Chaffee, Mrs. H.I. Cardeza, Mr. Thomas. Cummings, Mrs. J. Chevry, Paul. Cherry, Miss Gladys. Chambers, Mr. and Mrs. N.C. Carter, Mr. and Mrs. W.E. Carter, Master William. Compton, Mrs. A.T. Compton, Miss S.R. Crosby, Mrs. E.G. Crosby, Miss Harriet. Cornell, Mrs. R.C. Chibnall, Mrs. E. Douglas, Mrs. Fred. De Villiers, Monsieur. Daniel, Miss Sarah. Daniel, Robert W. Davidson, Mr. and Mrs. Thornton and family. Douglas, Mrs. Walter and maid. Dodge, Miss Sarah. Dodge, Mrs. Washington and son. Dick, Mr. and Mrs. A.A. Danielle, H. Heron. Drotsinstead, A. Dally, Peter D. Andres, Miss Caroline. Ellis, Miss. Earnshaw, Mrs. Bolton. Eustace, Miss E. Emmock, Philip E. Flagenheim, Mrs. Antoinette. Franicatelli, Mizey. Finn, J.I. Fortune, Miss Alice. Fortune, Miss Ethel. Fortune, Mrs. Mark. Fortune, Miss Mabel. Frauenthal, Dr. and Mrs. H.W. Frauenthal, Mr. and Mrs. T.G. Frolicher, Miss Margaret. Frolicher, May and Mrs. Frolicher, Miss N. Futrell, Mrs. Jocks. Gracie, Colonel Archibald. Graham, Mr. and Mrs. William. Graham, Miss M. Gordon, Sir Cosmo Duff. Gordon, Lady. Gibson, Miss Dorothy. Goldenberg, Mr. and Mrs. Samuel. Goldenberg, Miss Ella. Greenfield, Mrs. L.P. Greenfield, G.B. Greenfield, William. Gibson, Mrs. Leonard. Gooch, James. Haven, Mr. Henry B. Harris, Mrs. H.B. Holverson, Mrs. Alex. Hodgeboom, Mrs. J.C. Hawksford, W.J. Harper, Henry and manservant. Harper, Mrs. H.S. Hold, Miss J.A. Hope, Nina. Hoyt, Mr. and Mrs. Fred. Horner, Henry R. Harder, Mr. and Mrs. George. Hayes, Mrs. Charles M. and daughter. Hippach, Miss Jean. Hippach, Mrs. Ida S. Ismay, J. Bruce. Janasco, Mrs. J. Kimball, Mr. and Mrs. Ed N. Kennyman, F.A. Kinchin, Miss Emil. Longley, Miss G.F. Leader, Miss A.F. Leahy, Miss Nora. Lavery, Miss Bertha. Lines, Mrs. Ernest. Lines, Miss Mary. Lindstrom, Mrs. Singard. Lesnure, Gustave Jr. Madill, Miss Georgette A. Mahan, Mrs. Melicard, Monsieurs. Menderson, Miss Leta. May, Miss Roberta. Marvin, Mrs. D.W. Marichel, Pied. Maroney, Mrs. R. Meyer, Mrs. E.I. Mock, Mr. P.E. Middle, Monsieur M. Ogivi. Minahan, Miss Daisy. Minahan, Mrs. W.E. McGow, James. Newell, Miss Alice. Newell, Miss Madeline. Newell, Washington. Newson, Miss Helen. O'Connell, Miss R. Ostby, E.C. Ostby, Miss Helen. Omond, Fiam. Panhart, Miss Ninette. Piers, Mrs. E. Pomeroy, Miss Ellen. Potter, Mrs. Thomas Jr. Puchin, Major Arthur. Peercott, Miss A. Ryerson, John. Renago, Mrs. Mamam. Renelt, Miss Appy. Rothschild, Mrs. Lord Martin. Rosenbaum, Miss Edith. Rhymes, Mr. and Mrs. George. Rosibel, Miss H. Rhodes, Countess. Robert, Mrs. Edna. Rolmain, C. Ryerson, Alice Susan P. Ryerson, Miss Emily. Ryerson, Mrs. Arthur and maid. Stone, Mrs. George M. Skeller, Mrs. William. Segaster, Miss Emma. Seward, Fred K. Shutter, Miss. Sloper, William T. Swift, Mrs. J. Joel. Schaubert, Mrs. Paul. Shadell, Robert Douglas. Snyder, Mr. and Mrs. John. Serapica, Alice Augusta. Silvertiern, R. Spencer. Sailfield, Adolph. Stahilin, Max. Seminois, Alphonsus. Smith, Mrs. Lucien P. Stevenson, Mrs. Walter. Solomon, Abraham. Sylvie, Mrs. William B. Stenmel, Mr. and Mrs. Hillary. Spencer, Mrs. W. A. and maid. Slater, Miss Hilda. Spedden, Mr. and Mrs. F.O. and child. Stephenson, H.B. Strauss, Mrs., maid of. Schaubert, Mrs. Emma. Slinter, Mrs. E. Simmons, A. Taylor, Miss. Tucker, Mrs. and maid. Thayer, Miss J.B. Thayer, J.B. Jr. Tossig, Miss Ruth. Tossig, Mrs. E. Thor, Miss Ella. Thorne, Mrs. G. Taylor, Mr. and Mrs. E. Z. Trout, Miss Jessie. Tucker, Gilbert. Woolner, Hugh. Ward, Miss Anna. Williams, Richard M. Jr. Warren, Mrs. P. Wilson, Miss Helen A. Williard, Miss C. Wick, Miss Mary. Wick, Geo. Widener, valet of. Widener, Mrs. George D. and maid. White, Mrs. J. Stewart. Young, Miss Marie. List of survivors, second cabin. Abason, Mrs. Mana. Abbott, Mrs. R. Argenia, Mrs. and 2 children. Angel, F. Angle, William. Balmthorpe, Mrs. L. Balls, Mrs. Ada E. Buss, Miss Kate. Becker, Mrs. A. O. and 3 children. Bean, Edward. Bean, Mrs. Ethel. Bryhe, Miss D. Beasley, Mr. L. Brown, Mr. T.W.S. Brown, Miss E. Brown, Mrs. Benton, Lillian W. Bystron, Carolina. Bright, Dagmar. Bright, Daisy. Clark, Mrs. Ada. Cameron, Miss C. Caldwell, Albert F. Caldwell, Mrs. Sylvan. Caldwell, Alden, infant. Christie, Mr. and Mrs. Collier, Mrs. Charlotte. Collier, Miss Marjorie. Christie, Miss Alice. Colette, Stithard. Krista, Miss Disha. Charles, William. Croft, Millie Mall. Doling, Mrs. Elise. Drew, Mrs. Lulu. Davis, Mrs. Agnes. Davis, Miss Mary. Davis, John M. Duvan, Florentine. Duvan, Mibbs A. Davidson, Miss Mary. Doling, Miss Ada. Driscoll, Mrs. B. Dystrom, Caroline. Encarnacion, Mrs. Ronaldo. Faunthorpe, Mrs. Lizzie. Formery, Miss Ellen. Garside, Ethel. Garachi, Mrs. Marcy. Genovese, Angier. Hart, Mrs. Esther. Hart, Eva. Harris, George. Hewlett, Mrs. Mary. Heber, Miss S. Hoffman, Lola. Hoffman, Lewis. Harper, Nina. Hold, Stephen. Hold, Mrs. Anna. Hawking, Mr. and Mrs. George. Hawking, Miss Nellie. Herman, Mrs. Jane, 2 daughters. Healy, Nora. Hanson, Jeannie. Hamathian, W. Hamathian, Anna. Harnlin, Anna and child. Elette, Bertha. Jackson, Mrs. Amy. Juliet, Levinch. Jerwan, Mary. Juhan, Poldrel. Jacobson, Mrs. Keene, Miss Nora H. Kelly, Mrs. F. Cantar, Mrs. A. Leitch, Jessie. LaRoche, Mrs. and Miss Simone. LaRoche, Miss Louise. Layman, Bertha. Launch, Mrs. Alex. Lenore, Amelia. Lystrom, Mrs. C. Mellinger, Elizabeth. Mellinger, child. Marshall, Mrs. Kate. Mallette, A. Mallette, Mrs. and child. Mange, Paula. Mayor, Mrs. Florence. Miller, W.J. McDermott, Miss Layla. McGowan, Anna. Nye, Elizabeth. Nasser, Mrs. Delilah. Noosa, Mrs. A. Oxenham, Percy J. Phillips, Alice. Palace, Emilio. Padro, Jitleon. Prinsky, Rosa. Portatilli, Emilio. Parsh, Mrs. L. Plett, B. Quick, Mrs. Jane. Quick, Mrs. Vera W. Quick, Miss Phyllis. Renardo, Miss E. Ridgedale, Lucy. Renoff, Mrs. Lily. Rugg, Miss Emily. Richards, M. Rogers, Miss Selina. Richards, Mrs. Amelia, 2 boys, and Mr. Richards, Jr. Simpson, Miss. Sincock, Miss Maud. Sinconin, Anna. Smith, Miss Marion. Sylvan, Lyle. Trant, Mrs. J. Toomey, Miss E. Trout, Miss E. Trout, Miss Cecilia. Ware, Miss H. Water, Miss N. Wilhelm, CBAS. Watt, Mrs. A. and 2 children. Williams, Ricarbard, M. Jr. Wise, Matilda. Weber, Miss Sajid. Wright, Miss Marion. Wright, Miss Marion. Watt, Miss Bessie. Watt, Miss Betka. West, Mrs. E.A. West, Miss Constance. West, Miss Barbara. Wells, Addie. Wells, Master. A list of surviving third cabin passengers and crew is omitted owing to the impossibility of obtaining the correct names of many. Roll call of the dead. First cabin. Allison, H.J. Allison, Mrs. and maid. Allison, Miss. Andrews, Thomas. Astor, Colonel J.J. and servant. Anderson, Walker. Beatty, T. Brandeis, E. Buckneville, Mrs. William, maid of. Ballman, J. Baxter, Mr. and Mrs. Quigg. Bjornstrom, H. Burnham, Jacob. Blackwell, S.W. Borbank, J.J. Bowen, Miss. Brady, John B. Brew, Arl. Butt, Major A. Clark, Walter M. Clifford, George Q. Coley, E.P. Cardeza, T.D.M., servant of. Cardeza, Mrs. J.W., maid of. Carlson, Frank. Corin, F.M. Corin, J.P. Chaffee, Mr. H.I. Chisholm, Robert. Compton, A.T. Crafton, John B. Crosby, Edward G. Cummings, John Bradley. Dooley's, William C. Douglas, W.D. Douglas, Master R., nurse of. Evans, Miss E. Fortune, Mark. Foreman, B.L. Fortune, Charles. Franklin, T.P. Futrell, J. G. Arthur. Goldenberg, E.L. Goldschmidt, G.B. Giglio, Victor. Guggenheim, Benjamin. Hayes, Charles M. Hayes, Mrs. Charles, maid of. Head, Christopher. Hilliard, H.H. Hipkins, W.E. Hogenheim, Mrs. A. Harris, Henry B. Harp, Mr. and Mrs. Charles M. Harp, Miss Margaret and maid. Holverson, A.M. Islam, Miss A.E. Ismay, J. Bruce, servant of. Julian, H.F. Jones, C.C. Kent, Edward A. Kenyon, Mr. and Mrs. F.R. Claber, Herman. Lamberth, William, F.F. Lawrence, Arthur. Long, Milton. Lewy, E.J. Loping, J.H. Lingry, Edward. McGuire, J.E. McCaffrey, T. McCaffrey, T. Jr. McCarthy, T. Middleton, J.C. Millet, Frank D. Minahan, Dr. Meyer, Edgar J. Molson, H. M. Moore, C. Servant. Newell, Miss T. Nicholson, A. S. Parr, M. H. W. Pierce, Mr. and Mrs. Thomas. Penasco, Mr. and Mrs. Victor. Partner, M. A. Payne, Y. Puffer, C. C. Robert, Mrs. E. maid of. Roebling, Washington, A. the second. Rood, Hugh. Rose, J. Hugo. Rothes, Countess, maid of. Rothschild, M. Ryerson, A. Sylvie, William B. Spencer, W. A. Steed, W. T. Stone, Mrs. George, maid of. Strauss, Mr. and Mrs. Isidore. Sutton, Frederick. Smart, John. Smith, Clinch. Smith, L. P. Taussig, Emil. Thayer, Mrs. maid of. Thayer, John B. Thorne, G. Vanderhoof, Wyckoff. Walker, W. A. Warren, F. M. White, Percival A. White, Richard F. Widener, G. D. Widener, Harry. Wood, Mr. and Mrs. Frank P. Weir, J. Williams, Dwayne. Wright, George. Second cabin. Abelson, Sampson. Andrew, Frank. Ashby, John. Aldworth, C. Andrew, Edgar. Bracken, James. Brown, Mrs. Bright, Narl. Bailey, Percy. Bainbridge, C. R. Biles, the Reverend Thomas. Beauchamp, H. G. Berg, Ms. E. Bentham, I. Bateman, Robert J. Butler, Reginald. Botsford, Hull. Bowener, Solomon. Clark, Charles. Clark, Bandsman. Corey, Mrs. C. P. Carter, the Reverend Ernest. Carter, Mrs. Coleridge, Reginald. Chapman, Charles. Cunningham, Alfred. Campbell, William. Corbett, Mrs. Irene. Chapman, John E. Chapman, Mrs. E. Colander, Eric. Cotterill, Harvey. Deacon, Percy. Davis, Charles. Dibben, William. DeBrito, Jose. Denborney, H. Drew, James. Drew, Master M. David, Master J. W. Downton, W. J. Dilvarlo, S. Dilvarlo, Mrs. Frost, A. Finnery, Mr. Faunthorpe, H. Philbrook, C. Funk, Annie. Falstrom, A. Fox, Stanley, W. Greenberg, S. Giles, Ralph. Gaskell, Alfred. Gillespie, William. Gilbert, William. Gall, S. Gall, John. Giles, Edgar. Giles, Fred. Gale, Harry. Garvey, Lawrence. Hickman, Leonard. Hickman, Linvis. Hume, Bandsman. Hickman, Stanley. Hood, Ambrose. Hodges, Henry. Hart, Benjamin. Harris, Walter. Harper, John. Harbeck, W. H. Hoffman, Mr. Herman, Mrs. S. Howard, B. Hale, Reginald. Hunt, George. Jacobson, Mr. Jacobson, Sidney. Jeffrey, Clifford. Jeffrey, Ernest. Jenkins, Stephen. Jarvis, John D. Keene, Daniel. Kirkland, Reverend C. Carnes, Mrs. F. G. Krillner, J. H. Krenz, Bandsman. Cantor, Selena. Knight, R. Lingam, John. Levy, R. J. Loch, Charles. Layson, W. R. N. LaRoche, Joseph. Lamb, J. J. McCain, Peter. Milling, Jacob. Melachard, Noel. Morawick, Dr. McCrae, Arthur G. McCry, James M. McCain, Peter D. Mudd, Thomas. Mack, Mrs. Mary. Marshall, Henry. Mayberg, Frank H. Meyer, August. Miles Thomas, Mitchell Henry, Matthew W.J., Nesson Israel, Nicholas Joseph C., Norman Robert D., Otter Richard, Phillips Robert, Poncel Martin, Payne Alfred, Parks Frank, Pengelly F., Pernot Renee, Parker Clifford, Polbaum Frank, Renoff Peter H., Rogers Harry, Reeves David, Sobey Hayden, Slatter Miss H. M., Stanton Ward, Sword Hans K., Stokes Philip J., Sharp Percival, Sedgwick Mr. F. W., Smith Augustus, Sweet George, Taylor Bandsman, Turpin William J., Turpin Mrs. Dorothy, Turner John H., Tiervin Mrs. A., Veal James, Watson E., Woodward Bandsman, Ware William J., Wise Leopold, Whedon Edward, Ware John J., West E. Arthur, Wheeler Edwin, Werman Samuel. The total death list was 1,635. Third cabin passengers and crew are not included in the list here, given owing to the impossibility of obtaining the exact names of many. The identified dead. On April 25th, the White Star Line officials issued a corrected list of the identified dead. While the corrected list cleared up two or more of the wireless confusions that caused so much speculation in the original list, there still remained a few names that, so far as the record of the Titanic showed, were not on board that ship when she foundered. The new list, however, established the fact that the body of George D. Widener of Philadelphia was among those on the Mackay Bennett, and two of the bodies were identified as those of men named Butt. List of identified dead. Following is a list of those whose identity was wholly or partially established: Astor John Jacob, Adonis J., L. William, Ash H. W., Adal Moritz, Anderson Thomas, Adams J., Esblande Carl, Allen H., Anderson W. Y., Allison H. J., Butt W., seaman. Butt W., may be Major Butt. Butterworth Abel, Bailey G. F., Barker E. T., Butler Reginald, Birnbaum Jacob, Bristol R. C., Buckley Catherine, Chapman John H., Chapman Charles, Connors P., Clong Milton, Cox Denton, Cavendish Tyrell W., Carbines W., Dutton F., Dashwood William, Dulles W.C., Douglas W.D., Donati Italo, waiter. Engineer A.E.F., Elliott Edward, Farrell James, Faunthorpe H., Gill J.H., Greenberg H., Galinsky Leslie, Graham George, Giles Ralph, Givard Hans C., Hanson Henry D., Hayter A., Hayes Charles M., Hodges H. P., Hell J. C., Hewitt T., Harrison H. H., Hale Reg, Hendrick Tosnai, Hinton W., Harbeck W. H., Holverdon A. O., probably A. M. Halverson of Troy, Hoffman Lewis M., Hinckley G., hospital attendant, no name given, Johansson Malcolm, Johansson Eric, Johansson Gustav J., Johansson A. F., Jones C. C., Kelly James, Lawrence A., Louch Charles, Long Milton, Lily A., Linhart Wenzel, Marriott W.H. No such name appears on the list of passengers or crew. Mangan Mary, McNamee Mrs. N., probably Miss Eileen McNamee. Mac Mrs. Monroe Jean, McCaffrey Thomas, Morgan Thomas, Moen Sigurd, Newell T.H., Nasser Nicholas, Norman Robert D., Petty Edwin H., Partner Alston, Penny Olson F., Ragazzi A. Boothby, Rice J.R., Robbins A., Robinson J.M., Rosenshine George, Stone J., Stewart 76, Stokes Philip J., Stanton W., Strauss Isidore, Sage William, Sutton Frederick, Souther Simon, Shedid Nihil, Swank George, Sebastiano Del Carlo, Stanbrock A., Tomlin Etnest P., Talbot G., Vilner Hendrick K., Vasilios Castaveles, thought to be a confusion of two surnames, Veer W., maybe W. J. Ware or W. T. Steed, Widener George W., Williams Leslie, Wers Albert, Wickland Jacob A., Waylands Achille, White F. F., Woody O. S., Wers Leopold, Zacharian Maury Der.